بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Salam, hello, bonjour. Welcome to the show. I'm Adnan Husain, professor of medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world history. And I'm really excited about conversation today about a great book, Shakespeare Through Islamic Worlds, with its author, Dr. Ambereen Dadhabhoy. But before I introduce my guest and the conversation, I do just want to thank you for coming to this channel or listening as a podcast. So viewers and listeners, I want to thank you. This is a new channel. So if you're enjoying the kinds of work and analysis and discussions that I'm doing on this channel, I hope that you will like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so that other people who you think might be interested in it will come to know about it on social media or in your networks. And if you're listening as a podcast, I encourage you, please give a review or a rating on whatever platform you're listening to. And of course, if you want to support us, you can do that at patreon.com/Adnan Husain. Well, with that out of the way, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while with Dr. Ambereen Dadhabhoy about this wonderful book, Shakespeare Through Islamic Worlds, that was published just last year. And Ambereen, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on. I'm so glad that you could make time for it. I just want to tell listeners that you are an associate professor of literature at Harvey Mudd College, which is one of the 5, I think it is, Claremont colleges in Claremont, California, and environs. My high school best friend went there, so I happened to visit, so I do know what it's like at Harvey Mudd a little bit. She is co-author of Anti-Racist Shakespeare from 2023, which you wrote with Nada Mahdizadeh, and many articles on race and religion and early modern English literature. You have a website, and I understand that you spent time living in and teaching in Istanbul in Turkey. So when it comes to all the references that take place in this book and in Shakespeare's plays to the geographies of the Ottoman Empire, you're somebody who's been in the city. So welcome again. I wanted to start by asking you, why did you write this book? You obviously are concerned and interested in race and early modern literature, but why this book, Shakespeare Through Islamic Worlds, especially given what might seem like a paradox to many people that Shakespeare doesn't really discuss or talk about Islam and Muslims in very explicit ways. So, what brought you to this to this project?
So, really starting with the heavy-hitting questions there. That is a question that I ask myself quite frequently. Certainly when I was doing my PhD and writing my dissertation, I was thinking more broadly in terms of Shakespeare and early modern drama's representation of those who were characterized as religiously or racially different, others, if you will. And after writing my dissertation, I sort of really began thinking more about race and racism as how they structurally affected the representation of these kinds of characters in the drama, and moving away a little bit from thinking about religion. And the only reason why was because in the field of early modern English studies, race and racism and religious difference, it's often sort of like a chicken or the egg situation. Which came first? Was it religious difference that then becomes racial difference, or is it racial difference that becomes religious difference? And for me, both of them were tethered together, but there was a very particular lack of education about what race is, how racism works, how it manifests, and a sort of discounting of, oh, well, these are more contemporary theorizations and methodologies, so they don't really affect us in the pre-modern world. And my sense always, as a Muslim reader of these texts, was that that's wrong. Like, I get that the representation of Islam and Muslims is very problematic and demonizing, but underneath that, like layered with the demonizing of the religion is also how these characters are racialized, and racialized through skin, but through culture, through practice. But I really felt like it was accepted in the field to think about Muslims as different, but not necessarily to think about race. So that's sort of where my work took a little bit of a detour. And then I was asked to write a book for this series, and I was tossing around a lot of ideas. And then I had been working on other things. I'd been returning to Islam and Muslims because I was working on this play that I don't really like that much. And I don't recommend working on things that you don't really like that much. But it's Ayad Akhtar's Pulitzer Prize winning play, Disgraced. I don't know if you know it. It's a war on terror play, and it has sort of a skeleton of Othello in it, which is the reason why I was interested in it. I find it to be horrible and really problematic, and very much about a certain kind of respectability politics. And I also think it's a lot anti-Black. So all of those things were things I was thinking about in the context of thinking about this book and the resurgence of conversations around terror and terrorism, but really in the US, white nationalist terrorism, and how any kind of legislation about terrorism was not going to actually, in fact, affect white people, but would, in fact, come back on brown, Black, Muslim people in problematic ways. So all of that was kind of going through my head. And then I was just thinking about so when I pitched this book, if you look at the proposal, it's about all of the different Islamic hate geographies globally and how they do or do not engage with Shakespeare's works. So like that would be 5 books, not one. And so as I then sat down to write the book, I thought about what is the geography that I know best that intersects with these plays, even though Shakespeare chooses not to represent the people of those geographies. So then I settled on thinking through the Mediterranean, and also very deliberately thinking about how Muslims and Islam is racialized, right? I really wanted to bring that thread into this book. And the other thread that I really wanted to bring into this book was Orientalism, because in the pre-modern period, Said's work is discounted as not being applicable because he's writing about the 18th and 19th centuries. And I think that that's a really convenient way to not engage with the substance of what he's saying. So it was a long journey.
Mm-hmm. Well, but that's interesting. What you just ended on is, I think, a really interesting problem and question, because in fact, actually, while the substance or the majority of Orientalism does talk about 18th and 19th century and into 20th century um, forms of knowledge and power during the high colonial eras, Said himself is not interested in restricting the kind of conceptualization of Orientalism to 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, but argues, and this is where much of his work has actually been critiqued, actually. Uh, but suggests that it has deeper roots in Western culture, that in fact actually the Orient was the kind of counter discursive nexus for the Occident's self-formation, and as a result was always a necessary projection. It may have taken different shape, but there is a perduring kind of obsession with and concern and anxiety over something called the East, that he locates all the way back into kind of Greek-Persian conflict, into the medieval period, which is a period that I work on. But I think the one difference that patterns this is that uh, that has happened in the sort of prehistory of some of the motifs and the images that still have relevance in the 19th and 20th centuries, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, is this kind of desire and fear of the other, but that the power relation and the fear was very significant, not as a sort of suppressed or subliminal fear of the other, but as an actual geopolitical fear, because the, Islamic world, the East was, sovereign, powerful, maybe wealthier, maybe more advanced, like all of these kinds of concerns um, are relevant to the construction of the Saracen, of the Muslim, of the Persians. I mean, let's remember the Persians, were ruling a massive empire. The Greeks were small city-states on this archipelago, and they, had this apprehension about the power of these, Cyrus, Darius, right? I mean, so that seems to be different, but that there still is this relevance in the earlier period. So I'm wondering how you think about that and about that problem that the dismissal of Said is really, it seems to me, there may be ways you could critique the way he analyzes the discourse of Orientalism, and it's situated contextually in different power, relations with the East. But the dismissal of it seems to me a pretty crude unwillingness to engage with an important topic that is clearly relevant in all of these eras. So how do you kind of engage with that and convince your colleagues that they've missed something very important?
Yeah, I think about that a lot in terms of, why for so long this very vital method and theory has been elided in the field. And I have two answers. The first answer, I think, is the fact that people have very real attachments to the things that they decide they're going to get PhDs in. I certainly have a real attachment to Shakespeare. But that attachment can also lead to a way of wanting to think of our era. And I think it's especially true, and I can only speak for pre-modern studies, so I'll say it's especially true for these periods, is that we want to think of them as being innocent of the kind of dirty, grimy things that develop in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially like the period of European colonialism, the transatlantic trade in human beings, the genocide of indigenous people, right? All of those things we can trace to our period and we can trace even earlier. And yet there is a desire to not see, right? We need to not see those things so we can think about the artistic output as not being implicated in those really horrible things that in fact allowed the artistic output to happen in the first place, right? Like here's the argument of culture and imperialism. So I think that has really, and because material realities, as you say, were quite different in terms of the Ottoman Empire and its geographies weren't being subjugated by European colonialism. Yes, I will grant you all of those things. We had the Saadian dynasty in Morocco. We have Islamic powers, so-called Islamic powers, ascendant in the geographies over which they ruled, India, for example, or the Mughal Empire. However, just because there's no material power, yes, Said's argument is that knowledge serves material power, but I think that the knowledge and the discursive representation of Muslims as representation, right? They're not real. There's no real Muslims that any of these people are encountering, is serving a certain kind of knowledge ideology, which is then going to be in service of power, right? Like the dots are very easy to connect. As you said, it's a very crude dismissal, but I think it serves that function. I think the other reason is that Edward Said was Palestinian. And I think that we cannot overlook the fact of the attacks on him as a person, there are also attacks on the work that he did. Both serve to delegitimize his work. And so the kind of the way that we can write him off is then a way that we can write off everything that he produced too.
Right. Well, I think actually, in some ways, I mean, it's such an interesting point because I think one really has to look at Orientalism as part of a trilogy that was published. All these books were published one right after the other, covering Islam being the last of the three and the one that is, the least perhaps really engaged. But the question of Palestine and Orientalism and covering Islam are clearly part of him wrestling with a phenomenon that he wanted to study intellectually that he saw somehow as interrelated, even though they could be separate topics and subjects of these separate books. He was thinking them together. And one thing that I find really unfortunate is even among those who actually adopt Orientalism as a conceptual paradigm, as a theory for investigating post-colonial or colonial and post-colonial literature and culture, is that they will ignore the other two, and only think about, what they can, excavate from Orientalism that might be useful conceptually in talking about representations of the other and so on. But it sounds like, from your perspective also, that even Orientalism might have been, as a theory, conceptually tainted by its proximity to questions of, settler colonialism in Palestine and, the global war on terror and Islamophobia that he's sort of dealing with in covering Islam.
I mean, in the introduction of Orientalism, he ends it where he says, nobody in the West, you cannot find people who have sympathy with the Arab. And that whole last paragraph is framed through like, why can't you right now, as I'm writing this in 1978, right? And then where are we now in 2025? And it seems to continue to be true. So I think that the question of Palestine was never far from his mind as he was writing it. And so absolutely it is related to all of those other books. And, the fact that in Orientalism, he also says, sorry, my cat is like wanting to scratch her face on my computer. He says somebody needs to study the role of empire in artistic and literary productions. And I guess he was like, well, I guess it's going to be me who does those things too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, maybe coming back to Shakespeare and the book and the argument that you're making, you point out that both in the introduction and conclusion that you're working with very kind of fragmentary material, right? There are not a lot of references. But this is actually strange in its own way. And Orientalism was, of course, all about the portrayal and representation and how it suffused so many different genres of high culture and literature in the West, right? That, Said was positing. It's astonishing that nobody has really studied this in a kind of conceptually, integrative way, because it pops up and appears throughout, the idea of the Oriental despot, all of these Orientalist paintings and so on. And what you're dealing with is maybe in some ways the inverse, which is thinking about Orientalism not through the portrayal of Muslims and Muslim cultures and peoples in a sort of direct way, but the use of those, the invocation of those stereotypes in a kind of palimpsest behind the text, because there's so few actual references. And you do a lot of work of trying to explain where it does appear and how it does appear, in Shakespeare's work. But maybe before you tell us about what you think about that suppression or ignoring, or however you want to characterize it, as you did in this wonderful work, what's the context of the literary scene for Shakespeare and for English drama during this period, where it is a striking contrast that Shakespeare doesn't talk about it? I mean, It's because many others do during that period. But for our readers, listeners, and viewers who may not be familiar with early modern English literature, how would you characterize the portrayal and the kinds of literary motifs in which you do find, the Turkish plays or the portrayal and representation of Islam and Muslims in English literature of the period?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. So it is, you know, the literary scene, right? Shakespeare in many ways is because of his high cultural capital and status now and for centuries is decontextualized from from the actual dramatic scene that he was in. He wasn't, when he started writing his plays, he wasn't the preeminent playwright, and there were many important playwrights that came after him, or certainly more commercially successful or as commercially successful playwrights that came after him. So he's in a tradition and a trajectory of a flourishing of early modern English drama, let's say. And before Shakespeare, we have people like Christopher Marlowe, we have people like George Peele who are writing about, so George Peele has this play called The Battle of Alcazar, which is based on a real battle where there was sort of Portuguese imperial intervention in who's going to have the throne of Morocco, and the Portuguese lose. And so the play is dramatizing like very contemporary events. And we have, here is one of the first instances of different kinds of, quote, Moors on the English stage, right? So Shakespeare didn't invent this kind of character. This character's association with Africa, with Blackness, with Islam is, again, not of Shakespeare's creation. We have Christopher Marlowe writing 2 plays about Tamburlaine, who is fighting and conquering all over Asia, right? So the idea of Asia, of different imperial regimes in Asia being depicted on the English stage was nothing new. And obviously it was so popular that he wrote a sequel, right? We don't write sequels to plays that are not commercially successful. And then he also had The Jew of Malta, where you have this Eastern Mediterranean setting, you have Jewish, Muslim, and Christian characters, you have this so-called religious conflict. All of these things are quite prolific already on this stage. And then you have Shakespeare coming along, and then you have lots of early modern you have correspondence between the queen, which obviously wouldn't have been public, but the queen's relationship, like political relationship or courtship of the Ottoman Sultan through letters that she exchanged with his mother, her relationship with the Moroccan dynasty. There was an embassy that came to London in 1600 from the Kingdom of Morocco. It's written about the places where they stayed. The people who were part of the embassy would have been familiar to Shakespeare. He would have seen the procession. So there was a lot going on in his culture that he would have been aware of in terms of engagement with the so-called Islamic world or different kinds of Islamic cultures, not to mention histories and other things that we can trace that, part of his play seems to come from this book. So we can find that information. Also the history of Leo Africanus, his sort of geographical history of Africa was so popular at this time. It was translated to multiple European languages, including English, and Shakespeare would have had access to that. So he had all of this information at his fingertips. He had his contemporaries writing about these things. So it did proliferate in the way that Said talks about, in terms of at all levels of discourse. There were people talking about, writing about, constructing, representing Islamic regimes, Islam as a religion, Muslim peoples, all of these things. And so then when Shakespeare comes along and writes about these places but takes these people out, it seems to call attention to itself, which is the thing that I investigate in the book.
Right. So you're dealing with the comparative ignoring of that material, but not really ignoring it. So, this is what's so interesting, where some people might say, well, Shakespeare doesn't talk about, how could you write a whole book about Shakespeare doesn't talk about, Muslims the way Marlowe and Peele and others might have. But he does something particular in invoking. So you do a lot of, I think, wonderful work of situating, of recharacterizing the context in which these plays are set. They're set typically in the Mediterranean world. And the Mediterranean, for somebody who studies the medieval Mediterranean, is clearly a contested space. It's a very mixed place of encounters between different cultures, religions, ethnicities, languages. It's a big zone of contact, of hybridity, of cosmopolitan connections. So to set something in the Mediterranean, and you can think of like previous literature as really playing upon that. I mean, of course, from my era, there's been such great work recently on, thinking about Boccaccio's kind of some of the stories in the Decameron that have a sense of the mercantile Mediterranean and how merchants went back and forth between places like Naples and Tunis, and there are crusader kind of motifs, and Salah ad-Din, appears as a figure in some of these stories and so on. And so there's plenty of literary and cultural precedent if you're setting something in the Mediterranean that, in fact, actually you would want to make use of the fact that there are different religious identities in contact, and then have something to say literarily in the narratives. And there's so many stories like this, Crusader era narratives of, people crossing these borders and boundaries and traveling and so on. So when critics have come to Shakespeare's settings, what do they find? And what do you do with the way Shakespeare characterizes the Mediterranean space of Italy and southern, France and some of the islands? What's your approach to kind of thinking about that geography and what it must have meant in its time?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's such a great question in terms of the way that people have thought about Shakespeare's Italianate sources or thought about Shakespeare's Mediterranean has really been to cleave it from Asia and from Africa, right? So that then we have a Mediterranean that's simply a kind of, it's a northern Mediterranean, and it's a pool, a European pool, right? It has nothing to do with these other cultures unless we're in the Venetian plays, right? Unless we are in Othello, unless we're in The Merchant of Venice, or unless we're in Antony and Cleopatra, right? Where there is still a specific engagement. But Antony and Cleopatra is safe because it's a classical play, right? So we don't have to think about Islam in the context of Egypt because we're in the ancient past. In these other plays, we have the Ottomans very swiftly dealt with at the start of Othello. And then in The Merchant of Venice, really the threat is the threat of the Jew, although if, we don't even need to scratch the surface. The Prince of Morocco is right there. He's so, his attempt to represent a Mediterranean that is void of all of the different cultures that comprise the Mediterranean, all of the different cultures, religious traditions, racial distinctions, ethnic distinctions, all of those things, right? When he sets his plays there, they just come in anyway, right? Like in the Merchant of Venice, obviously they come in because the Prince of Morocco is clearly a character created to fulfill that role, but then they're kind of smuggled in through all of these references that he makes because he can't. It seems like he can't get around the fact that this world is populated by all of these other people. Those references are often denigrating references, but they're still there in a way. But what I think happens for critics in terms of what they make of it, I think it's a very and our contemporary moment, even before now, if we think about the so-called migrant crisis, has proven that the idea of the Mediterranean as a border between Africa and Europe, as a border between Asia and Europe, has always been porous, right? People on boats in the Mediterranean going from one place to another is as old as people in the Mediterranean are, right? That has always been a thing that is happening. But the construction of even the construction of Italy, right? When we talk about Shakespeare's Italian sources, there was no Italy when Shakespeare, right? There are city states. So the idea of a unified Italy, or of an Italy that is solely European, is also an invention, right? So there are all of these inventions that are going on in the representation, and it is an invention of a Europe that is not polluted or contaminated by non-Europeans, that scholars are also engaged in, wittingly or unwittingly.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it made me think as I was reading the book, and also as you're talking about this now, that I wonder if this is one reason why Shakespeare is constructed and came to be constructed as the supreme example of English literature, and the claims around his universality is that he has found a way, even if, of course, there are these dim references, there are a few characters, but he doesn't engage in a direct kind of encounter with the question of Islam and Muslims in the Mediterranean, but rather creates and manufactures a space that could be denuded of these people, except as marginal interlopers on the borders and boundaries of a kind of white Christian European space. And what he does, in some ways, to the late medieval and early modern Mediterranean is turn it into something like that protected and safer space of the classical world. So it's a kind of classicizing move in some way to erase the Muslim in the Mediterranean world, and he's interested in doing that. And in fact, he also we'll talk about it, but he also maybe interjects in some ways, the contemporary Moor into the classic. In the case of Titus Andronicus, and but we can talk about that move in a moment. But I'm wondering if this is part of the implicit, it's maybe somewhat unacknowledged, but implicit kind of value literarily that Shakespeare's works accomplish for an early modern and particularly later colonial sort of Western European audience that constructs him as the greatest English writer. I'm just wondering if that's something that's important, maybe in not just as you've done in this book, like deconstructing it and showing like this is a specific move, but in fact, in his reception, that he's accomplishing and doing something for European culture and the identity of the West, that those other writers who are engaging more directly with it and wrestling with, the matter and motif of Islam in the Mediterranean, that this is yet another kind of level of sophistication in terms of processing the way in which European identity wants to fabricate itself as free from, Islam and Muslims and contact, and transcendent, above it somehow.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're sort of anticipating my next book, but
hey, wonderful.
But I think you're absolutely right. Right, one of the kind of paradoxes that we deal with in terms of thinking about Shakespeare and thinking about issues of race and difference is, on the one hand, Shakespeare is a universal genius, right? He doesn't give us a lot of information about his characters, and so that we can all project ourselves into these. We can all be Lear, we can all be Hamlet, we can all be Juliet, we can all be Rosalind, except we can't, because when we think about the uproar that happens when people of color are cast in these parts, right? The racist, vitriolic, disgusting uproar about it, right? It just reminds us again of the whiteness of Shakespeare, or the white investment in Shakespeare, which is white, which is Christian, which is European, which is English particularly. So that, yeah, when Shakespeare is used to civilize my ancestors and probably your ancestors too, um, it was one, because apparently we didn't have great literature in our own languages to be able to do that, but we were supposed to be able to relate to this work on a humanistic level. So it was going to uplift, it was going to it was going to confirm our humanity, but our humanity would be, our humanity would be confirmed through our understanding of how great Shakespeare is. So in that way, he's universal. But the minute we try to then do something with Shakespeare, now we are appropriating something that is not for us. And so in that way, I think you're right that there is a kind of latent or unconscious recognition about the works, his canon's investment in whiteness, but also in a certain kind of Christianness and Europeanness that absolutely refuses to engage with Islam and Muslims, because that puts into question the whole idea of what is Europe. Like, where is the boundary of Europe? Muslims have always been in Europe. Muslims created Europe, or Europe was created through its antagonism of Islam and Muslims, right? Like, you cannot take us out of any conversation that is about Europe, because there is no Europe without Muslims.
That's right. And I mean, well, another way to say it perhaps is that Latin Christendom was not actually geographically coterminous with what we think of today as Europe. And even the question of Spain, and I noticed, in a previous conversation, you mentioned this, that Shakespeare also really dismisses with like engaging Spanish, material, even though this was, of course, very politically and culturally salient at the time. The Spanish Armada, all of this is going on at that time, and yet his plays are not really situated in Spain or vis-a-vis Spanish political and historical themes. And it just reminds me in some ways that it was a long process for Spain to become part of Europe, to be considered part of Europe. And much of it had to do with the fact that it was tainted by this history richly suffused with the presence of Jews and Muslims, and that it's only after, forcible conversion, and then deciding that even forcible conversion was not assimilation enough, and that in fact actually Jews and particularly Muslims were unassimilable, and even the descendants of forced Muslim converts to Christianity couldn't be tolerated, that they, the so-called Moriscos, had to also be expelled from these Catholic lands of Spain, but as well, of course, the establishment of new lines of social difference that simply migrated from religious identity as the structuring paradigm for a multi-religious polity under the Spanish kingdoms during the so-called Reconquista to ethnic, cultural kinds of questions. The problem was that these Moriscos are still listening to the zarfa and using henna and going to the hammam and, the so-called Turkish baths, and still using Arabic and so on. And that had to be eradicated. And when that wasn't enough, is because they've been polluted and tainted by their descent. And you talk about the limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood regulation, so that it moves to a biological or racialized or genealogical boundary of difference that rests upon it having been originally a religious boundary. That's at least, that supposedly you could just convert and now you will be part of the Christian Christendom. But Christendom is clearly not just a geography, its geography isn't the same exactly of what we think of as Europe, because it included, the Crusader states and, other places where there were Muslims, but that Christendom comes to be Europe when it gets rid of its Muslims. And of course, it's Jews, in Spain, but that's what allows Spain to become part of Europe, is that it has to evacuate that. And so it's interesting that Spain is not so, important for Shakespeare's plays, the context and settings of them. So this construction of Europe is something deeply implicated in what you've been talking about here, and in the book about the medieval and early modern Mediterranean and the Muslims in the Mediterranean as the kind of fundamental problem for the self-definition of Europe. So, at any rate, I forgot what my question was, and thinking about what you had put on the table and connecting it with histories that I'm, sort of familiar with. But I'm wondering if you have any, thoughts about. And well, it does relate to chapter 2. I think or chapter 1 is very important. The Muslims are coming, which is all about setting, the Tempest in the Mediterranean and reestablishing what really is the geography of the Mediterranean and its characteristics, both historically and literarily, and then for Shakespeare, what his moves to evacuate it, fundamentally accomplish.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, to just return to your question, it is curious, this kind of repression of Spain, and I think it's absolutely tied to Spain's 800-year weakness of being under Muslim rule and control. And certainly it wasn't all of Iberia, but it was a significant part of it. And Junaid Rana makes this argument in, now I'm blanking on his book, but he talks about the foundation of European race as being rooted in this moment of the expulsion of Muslims and Jews, and the fact that scholarly interest has converged more on the Jewish question than on the Muslim question is also interesting, because it then again serves to marginalize Muslims in conversations, not just about race making, but about like the idea of Europe. So I think we need to think through and tease those out more, especially in the way that the pre-modern informs the modern and modern racial ideas and logics. And at the same time, thinking about, Spain is, of course, a Mediterranean geography, and it's in the Western Mediterranean. And yet, because of its geographic proximity, it is tainted, as you said, just as like the eastern parts are tainted too because of the Ottoman Empire on the other side. What's interesting to think about is why Italy is not tainted, when Italy it's a hop, skip, and a jump from Africa to Malta to Sicily to the southern parts of Italy. And yet we don't have, Italy is so prominent in Shakespeare's plays, but perhaps that's because there's no, Italy can be a fantasy playground in a way maybe that Spain can't for his audiences, in a way that perhaps other places can't. And similarly, the idea of the Mediterranean, because it is so fluid, because we can divide it into Eastern, Western, Southern, Northern, that can also be another imagined geography where, again, these contests can take place safely because they're so far away. And at the same time, the triumph of Europe, the triumph of Christianity over these others resonates because of the illusions and the elusive quality that just even saying Mediterranean conjures.
Yeah. Well, and I want to conjure the Mediterranean as you do, I think really excitingly in your analysis of the Tempest, because that has been such a productive sphere for post-colonial critics to really think about English and British colonialism, the Caribbean, and to think about race and race making in the Atlantic world as a precursor to, the Black Atlantic, as it were. And so it's been a really kind of important play for these kinds of analyses. And yet, citing it in the Caribbean is really, a leap of imagination and of, contextualization in a later history that develops, while ignoring the importance and significance of the Mediterranean as the place where fundamentally the Latin West, what becomes Europe, is working out some of these concerns. And so what I was excited by with that chapter is the way it connects something that I'm interested in thinking about, is the importance of the Mediterranean for the Atlantic, that there are so many continuities between what happens in the Mediterranean, the working out of enslavement. I mean, if you think about the Crusades, for example, just as an example here, of conquest, of colonial settlement, to do what, in many cases, to try and establish sugar plantations with enslaved labor. It's basically working out in a way that ultimately is unsuccessful in the Mediterranean, because there's resistant Muslim power and sovereignty that is a danger, is a threat, and can throw off the crusader ambitions of the Latin West, and pushes them into the Mediterranean, into the Atlantic world, where they are then more successful in doing what they tried to do in the Mediterranean, which is to build plantation settler colonies, for a plantation economy. And this has been the genealogy for modernity, is like, okay, the Atlantic world creates, modernity in these kind of large scale world histories and so on. And yet it is, of course, predicated upon what they were attempting to do, what they experienced for several centuries in the Mediterranean. It's like no accident whatsoever that Christopher Columbus is when that's who has been involved in a lot of the slave networks, in the support of the Crusades, and colonizing and establishing trading entrepôts, attempts at sugar production and plantation style economies in the Mediterranean world, that when Ferdinand and Isabella are launching empire in the Atlantic, that they draw upon the expertise that's been established and developed over a few centuries by people further working in the Mediterranean. So that's all to say, we really need to understand why it's important and how it's important that the Tempest is taking place in a Mediterranean island. What's at stake there? And how does your reading and geographically citing it in a real Mediterranean, not just the imagined Mediterranean, but the real Mediterranean of the early modern world, what work does that do in reinterpreting, the play and the moves that Shakespeare is making?
Yeah, no, I mean, everything you just said, I agree with, in terms of, we, of course, need to. I think one of the things that we, in our current moment, face right now is a unwillingness to see the interconnected nature of struggles, right? Like, our struggles are not just our struggles, and our struggles are because of imperial networks. And so really thinking through the Mediterranean and its relations and its norms, and how they get exported, changed in the context of the Atlantic, in the context of the Western Hemisphere, is absolutely important. And yes, unique things do happen there, because that has a geographic specificity too. And yet they happen because they're connected. And, Ferdinand and Isabella, Spain and Portugal were the first, among the first European nations, Western European nations, to start mass kidnapping and enslaving African people. We have records from 1444. That's way before England starts, and England, has like a century to go before they start. But that technology is already there. They're already doing it in the Eastern Atlantic, in that Mediterranean sphere, in that border zone. And then they start doing it across the Atlantic. And I think that in terms of thinking about the Tempest, and just before I get to thinking about the Tempest, the work of people working on the Black Mediterranean Collective Working Group has been a wonderful resource in, again, thinking about one very important thing that Mediterranean studies, I think, doesn't do, which is really engage with the question of Africa and Blackness in important and significant ways. The Mediterranean is, it's separated out into thinking about North Africa and Europe and the eastern part and the Ottoman territories, but we really need to think about the relationship between North Africa and Africa, because that does also bleed into how we can conceptualize all of the negotiations that are going on in the Mediterranean, which I think is actually related to what I'm trying to say in this chapter on the Tempest, which is, again, to one of the reasons why the Atlantic geography, for Shakespeare scholars at least, has been why people even think about the Atlantic or quote the New World in the context of Shakespeare's this specific play, is because of a few references. There's a reference to a plantation that is made by Gonzago, I think. There's a reference to a Patagonian god that's made. And then there's a reference to a shipwreck, which is really in the Bermudas, right? Like, so those references. So in many ways, that is a similar kind of work that I'm doing. Like, let me mine these references and see what's happening. But from those, we have this tradition. But before Shakespeare scholars, of course, post-colonial Caribbean writers were already thinking about this play in that context. Shakespeare scholars were pretty late to thinking about how this play applies in this Atlantic context. But I think for Shakespeare scholars, it's at the expense of seeing, again, what can happen if we think through both of these, right? It's not a either or, but it's, yes, these are important references to the Atlantic world. And at the same time, the 90% of the plot is rooted in Mediterranean power negotiations. And when we ignore the instigating event of the start of the play, which is the marriage of Claribel to the King of Tunis, that should raise a lot of questions for us. And the first question it would raise is, is this if it's something that doesn't require notice, the fact that this European daughter of a duke is getting married to the King of Tunis, if that's not raising eyebrows or enough eyebrows, then is this a commonplace thing? Are we having these cross-confessional, cross-racial marriages on the regular in the early modern period? I don't think so, but I think we certainly are having many cross-confessional relations. We just have a lot of evidence for the kidnapping and enslavement of European women, similarly also the kidnapping and enslavement of African women. So all of these things are happening, and how they're being used, coerced into various kinds of labor, including sex work. We know that these things existed. So thinking through the Mediterranean, I think, allows us to think more expansively about this world and contact than we traditionally think about them, right? Like the writing off of Claribel, the writing off of Sycorax in many ways allows for us to write off how, like, the purpose, not just that women serve in this drama, but the purpose of women as vehicles for the imparting of culture. Obviously, we know that, but to think about the claims of sovereignty that are being made, right? Like, those claims are being overwritten in favor of other, more European claims in terms of the Atlantic world.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And that theme of sovereignty is one that comes up as a thread through, I think, a number of these chapters, and obviously is of great concern to Shakespeare and to early modern, I would say medieval and early modern Christian and European cultures in their relationship to, Muslim North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, and so forth. That this is the theme of Muslim sovereignty is really one that induces a lot of fear, anxiety, and concern. And in fact, actually, it just reminds me, I mean, perhaps one of the best examples of this that we might elaborate on further is this wonderful part of chapter 3 that you begin with Obama as an analog to Othello, thinking about the Moor in kind of Western Christian societies, but the way in which Louis Gohmert, I think he was a congressman at the time, right? Yeah. Characterizes the danger of Obama as the possible, like, because of his foreign policy and that he might have treasonous proclivities of loyalty to the Islamic world, whether he is a Christian or not. And I think it's interesting that both in Shakespearean scholarship, Othello is ambiguously identified by people as maybe he's a Muslim, maybe he's not. And Obama, maybe he's a Muslim secretly, despite claiming to be a Christian, maybe he's not. But what's more important in some ways, since that's between him and his God, right, as Louis Gohmert says, what's more important, however, is the geopolitical consequences of reconstituting kind of transnational, regional Muslim sovereignty again in a global terms, like the invocation of his policies helping resurrect the Ottoman Empire is really a statement about Muslim sovereignty in the world as an effective thing, rather than, appointed rulers who are suborned to the American imperial project. And that if that breaks down, they could be, there could be Muslims sovereign in the world. And that's a very dangerous thing that we have to fear and be concerned. So I was wondering, how you relate this kind of question of sovereignty, and particularly Muslim sovereignty, to the preoccupations of, kind of Western ideas about this geography and their relationship to it, and whether there are these resonances and inflections in Shakespeare to those concerns and themes.
Well, I mean, I think for Shakespeare, and I don't know if you watched that Louis Gohmert clip. I do have a link to it. You can just see it's a clip from the Daily Show, but he does get quite hysterical about this possibility and linking Obama to the Ottoman Empire. But I think for Shakespeare's time, and in a way for our own time, perhaps not as materially, but more psychologically, the threat of the Ottoman Empire was very real. The threat of being, and maybe not for England sitting so far away from the Mediterranean, but certainly for other Europeans, the idea that you could be taken over and made I'm trying to think of the right word, sort of made an outpost of Ottoman imperial sovereignty, where you would have to send your children as tribute to become administrators, military officials, just even soldiers in the Sultan's imperial army. That's not fake, right? Those things actually happen and are real. And so Twelfth Night, the play that's in the last chapter of the book, that's geography is Illyria, which is in Eastern Europe, it could be Bosnia, it could be other places. And we have textual evidence of people writing about a place called Illyria, somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, somewhere in the Balkans, which was a contested zone, which went in and out of Ottoman control, where we have a lot of evidence of people, of many men rising to the ranks of grand viziers who are not ethnically Turkish, but who are Ottoman in terms of they were kidnapped children who were then converted, many times castrated, and then made to serve in the Sultan's imperial administration. They helped their family rise too, right? Just because they were severed from their culture and their customs and their religions. They weren't necessarily severed from their families, though. And so there was still a possibility of a certain kind of social mobility, which is not a defense of any of those things that happened. This is just relating the things that happened. But that was real for Shakespeare's time. For our time, it is only this kind of threat of the Islamic boogeyman and Muslim sovereignty. I think it might be this fear of a caliphate, right? So if we just throw our minds back to a few years, the threat of ISIS and ISIS establishing a caliphate, and here then we have the dark flag of Islam that's going to throw its shadow over the rest of the world, and we need to save our women and we need to save our children. It's accomplishing the same kind of thing, but I think it obviously was material for the people who endured the brutality of those regimes, but it was manufactured for us sitting very safely in the imperial core to feel threatened, but not have any material effects of that real threat. So how it manifested was, again, a certain kind of hysteria and the demonizing of all Muslims under this banner of, well, Muslims have this kind of dual loyalty, and they're loyal to their religion more than they're loyal to any kind of state, and therefore we should fear them, and then overly criminalize them and surveil them to make sure they're not all secret terrorists in one way or another, even though we do think that they are secret terrorists.
Absolutely, yes. And so what you're talking about now is the way in which there are legacies of the preoccupations that you find in the early modern period. Of course, there's a changed world and a different context, and you have to be attentive to those specificities. Yet at the same time, there is some sort of a legacy, it seems, and continuity in habits of mind and thought that have been influential in being crystallized in literary motifs and preoccupations and concerns from this period. And so, this really, one of the moments where I saw this so clearly in your analysis was looking at the edict of Elizabeth about the Negroes and blackamoors who had found their way as in the course of, it wasn't clear to me if these are refugees from Spain who have fled and taken shelter during this period of rivalry and animosity and conflict geopolitically and commercially between England and Spain. But it's characterized as a drain, that these immigrants don't belong in England and that they are a drain upon our resources. And it just reminds me so much, of course, of the way in which the Muslim refugee, the immigrant, the laborer, the migrant laborer is talked about in not just far-right discourses, but frankly, more and more mainstream, discourses as well. And especially when it can be secularized in terms of national citizenship discourse and resources, that the citizens who actually belong deserve these resources of the welfare state, etc. And it's compromised by people who don't really belong, draining and undermining, the welfare state, for example, or social services, and so on. And so there just seems to be so much integration between an early modern kind of decision for expulsion and the kind of far right policy language, but not so far right kind of sense that these recent migrants, because of course we forget that there have been Muslims in Europe, for and hundreds of years, but these recent migrants don't really belong here, and they're a drain upon our resources and services and so on.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back before I get to this question, when we think about the genealogies, right? To think about, I mean, and in no way am I saying ISIS is in any way comparable to the Ottoman Empire, but this idea, the Western idea of caliphate, right, which is always this kind of militant, this figuring of Islam and Muslim cultures as militant, as violent, as seeking to overtake. And like you see all AI generated images online of like, this is what Europe is now, and it's like a white woman in a bus, and she's just surrounded by all vaguely Middle Eastern, quote, Arab, Muslim looking men. That is that kind, those ideas are deeply linked across the centuries. And then we get to, on the other side, we have the US Secretary of Defense with Crusader tattoos on him, right? Where he has, I think he also has a tattoo of the word infidel or kufar in Arabic on his arm, right? Like, or maybe that's somebody else, but it's quite a popular thing in the US. It's like, Muslims are living rent free in your head. Like, you have mutilated your body with an Arabic word just to signal how hostile you are to Muslims. This again is another version of Crusader militarism. But that goes on, like that violence goes unquestioned and is acceptable to the extent that this man is now in charge of the United States military.
He definitely is going to feature in the Crusading Society, a book that I'm writing, is going to have a concluding codon, like the way in which this sort of Crusader militancy is so important to particular ways of thinking about U.S. empire and
U.S. Christianity. I mean, I think that
yeah.
Just the idea that Arab Christians are not sufficiently Christian because they are Arabs. It feeds into, again, Christian imperial logics that are racist logics too, because Arabs are not sufficiently white enough. And then to get into the conversation about, I mean, yes, I think everything can be traced back to the early modern period in terms of ideas about forms of inclusion and exclusion. So when Elizabeth has those edicts, which we're not really sure were publicly read or acted upon, but those Black people arrived in London because of English Spanish hostility. So I think the underlying that is the idea that English ships took over some Spanish ships that had these people on them, and so then they just became refugees, and now there's so many of them, and they're draining our resources so much that the native inhabitants of the land don't have enough. So now we need to come up with a scheme to send them back. Yeah. Which is, when we read this in class, it sounds very familiar to my students.
Yeah. Unmistakably. Yes. Unmistakably so. So interesting. But I think it was, you pointed out that they were also characterized, that the vast majority of them are also infidel. So that was like a secondary, well, we don't know if it's secondary or primary. Obviously, the question of national resources was the more secular reason of state, kind of way of framing the need to evacuate this population. But the additional ideological justifications that they don't belong here because they're not a Christian people, most of them are infidels. And there was this whole question of paganism, and infidelity, and the way. So the kafir, yeah, that's the tattoo that you were referring to. Which is the Muslim word for somebody who's non-Muslim being adopted as a badge of honor. But of course, it is an epithet that is used in Christian discourse for Muslims, that they are faithless. They don't have a religion in the same way that Christianity is a religion. They are idolatrous potentially. This is certainly a motif in medieval European imagination of the more popular variety, at the same time that there are scholars who are discovering and polemicizing against Muslim theology. So at certain elite ecclesiastical levels, there's a great deal of awareness of Islam as a competing rival religious theological system. But popularly speaking, the way to delegitimize the Muslim and Muslim sovereignty is to say that it's not rooted in a real, genuine religion, and that it's idolatry. And the paganness of Islam seems to be, something that's also very important in the motifs of early modern Europe. And I was surprised to see that that still survived, this idea of the Muslim as idolatrous, since, there'd been, at least by that point, enough actual encounter with Islam as a rival religious and cultural system.
But to see, so I think, yes, absolutely, right? They knew they had, there was enough sophistication to even understand the difference between Sunni and Shia, and you can find that in documents. And so that they have this knowledge, and yet there continues to be this kind of projection, right? That I feel like there's more evidence of Christians calling Muslims infidels than there is of Muslims calling Christians or other people kuffar or kafir or infidel, right? And yet that word has been projected onto Muslims so that they are the ones who are intolerant. So we don't have to think about Christian intolerance, right? They are the ones who are pagan, despite the insistence in Islam on the oneness of God. And yet to deal with the somewhat incoherence of the Trinity, right? Like, let's not think about these things, and let's think about, these other people are the ones who are pagan. And what I find so interesting in the scholarship is that when these words crop up, scholars don't identify that these are, again, labels that are being used for Muslims. Right. So it's like, oh, these other people who are pagans, but they're not Muslims. Certainly, Europeans were encountering people who were not Muslims, who were in Africa and Asia. But these words were used for Muslims so often that when you see them, that alarm bell should be ringing off in your head, but it's not. One, because I don't think scholars are attuned to how Muslims are characterized in the very subtle demonizing ways that Islam as a religion is discredited.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, we've been talking a lot about the critics in your field, Shakespeare scholars, and I'm wondering what's been the reception. We've had a chance to think. I'm somebody who's very receptive to the idea that there's something at stake about Islam and Muslims in Shakespeare's work that is doing culturally important processing of, the making of world making, as you put it, of Western Christian identities, and perhaps in ways that can be more obviously secularized, or inventing and developing a secular language that will be very important for Europe's self-conception post-Enlightenment, that in fact doesn't actually change much about the status of Muslims and Islam, but just shifts the register by which they can be delegitimized or characterized as outside the fold of civilization. It's Christian civilization, and then they're not non-Christian and they're infidels. Then it's secular civilization and they're religious and benighted in this way. And all of that serves the colonial sort of project for hegemony and so on. So I'm definitely a great audience for this book. I enjoyed it so much, and I think it connects with concerns that I have in previous era, an earlier era. Um, but I'm wondering about the reception. How have your colleagues sort of taken to the many important arguments that you're making about the importance or significance of thinking Shakespeare through an Islamicate lens, or Islamicate concerns? How have they reacted, to this? I think they might have, it may be possible for them to deal with race, and have sophisticated discussions about that and about gender. And certainly, there's been, many generations of scholarship about anti-Semitism in various plays, particularly The Merchant of Venice. But I'm wondering, what's the reception been to your book? How have you been engaging with colleagues?
So far, it's been really positive. I'm guessing maybe if there's negative reception, I haven't yet heard it or read it, but I'm sure there are lots of things I think that are, for me, a good book is one that is going to open up ways for you to engage productively, which means also engage in disagreement. So far, I've had a little, in terms of there's some intentionality here, like Shakespeare deliberately excludes Muslims. I don't know that that's really intentionality. I just feel like the evidence of the plays shows that that's what happens. But I think overall, people have been very positive in terms of seeing the interventions that I'm trying to make. One is to think through geography in an important way. To the other is to then also think about how Islam is racialized. And so I think those are really resonating. I hope that my arguments about Orientalism are resonating with people, especially now. I was finishing this book. I edited out a part of a sentence that I have about the war on terror, and I had the ongoing war on terror, and I was like, oh, the war on terror is over, so I will now delete the ongoing part. Sadly, I did not anticipate the world that we were going to enter towards the end of 2023. But I think that it shows, it reveals to me that when I was writing this book, in many ways, I felt like the question of Islamophobia, certainly I knew that Islamophobia hadn't gone away, but I had felt that some lessons had been learned in the West by waging over 20 years of endless warfare in Islamicate geographies in Muslim majority countries. And that Barack Obama was the droner in chief and at the same time made some good rhetorical moves. So did other people in the Democratic Party. But I couldn't anticipate, obviously, but I should have, being a student of history, how deep the suspicion of Islam and Muslims is, as well as how deep the desire is to demonize these cultures, right? I guess I should have been a better student of Orientalism in that way. But I think that the book is kind of, my hope is that the book is a gateway for people to think more deeply about these things. And so far, from the responses that I've received, it has been. My book did get an honorable mention for the First Book Award at Shakespeare Association of America. So I guess that's good reception too.
Absolutely. I mean, it's good to know that people are going to be reading and engaging it, in your field. I think it's also important, I'll just say, as somebody who's, on the board of the International Islamophobia Studies and Research Association, even though I'm a medievalist, that it's useful to have works like yours, allies as colleagues who are saying there's a longer durée history that needs to be accounted for in trying to explain modern and contemporary Islamophobia, and precisely the point that you just mentioned, its sudden resurgence and return, even though, occupation, U.S. military occupation in Afghanistan ended, and in many ways people were thinking about the global war on terror as ending, that nonetheless, what I would call the crusading society continues to exist. And that's a progenitor for the conditions under which Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism expresses itself and manifests in a variety of different ways. And so having a longer historical compass when examining these things is important, so that we can actually understand its perdurance, its continuing relevance. Like, you can't make sense and understand Western politics now without really understanding Islamophobia. It just doesn't make sense without it. And then to sort of understand why the genocidal war in Gaza is something that the entire West has established its deep commitment to, despite the fact that it undermines everything about the universalism of human rights and so on, just like the universalism of Shakespeare. It's like, it's universal as long as it's European in its framing and characteristics. But if you contest that and assert your humanity under different terms, immediately that universalism collapses and we get the resurgence in an aggressive way. And that's why I don't think the language of hypocrisy is really useful anymore in talking about the political culture among the elites of the West now. That, oh, well, they're hypocrites because they adhere to universal international law and human rights, but yet they are making exceptions for the Palestinians and they're not enforcing it. That's not hypocrisy. I think works like yours shows that there is a deeper cultural investment. And it's so important that you apply this to the case of Shakespeare because of the cultural role and significance that Shakespeare's work holds in literary culture in the Anglophone, world. That I think this work really contributes so much to that effort. And with that, I think that's a good. I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that, but I feel like that's a kind of good way of concluding to encourage people to engage with this work, not just if you're a scholar of, early modern literature, but somebody who cares and is invested in a world that really does actually recognize, the humanness of the Muslim. I think it's important to read this work to really understand why it is and how it is that this can be denied to 1.5 billion people so easily.
Thank you. I think I will say that one of the things that's been very gratifying about the reception of this book has been to hear from people who are not Shakespeare scholars, who have picked this up, who have thought about it, who have engaged with my tweets about various things, but also this book, and to have interlocutors who are not Shakespeare scholars think through this, and to have people say to me, this is what I felt when I read these things. One of the things I was thinking about as I was thinking about our conversation today was, again, like, why did I write this book? I think I just wanted to affirm the feelings that I had as a Muslim reader when reading these texts, that there's something going on here that is not for me, and that, like, the role that I play in this book is the role of the villain, or in this play is the role of the villain. And that's what my culture is meant to be subdued in some way, which really, as a reader, denies you any kind of agency, and it certainly denies you any kind of identification. And the assumption about Shakespeare is that we can all identify with him, but we can't, not really. So, and I think that for readers who are Muslims, who have felt that way, not just about Shakespeare, but about a lot of things, like, I want them to have the language and the vocabulary that I necessarily didn't when I was starting out on this journey.
Well, I think readers, whether you're a Shakespeare scholar or not, readers will find an awful lot to be interested in this book. And so I want to encourage everyone to go pick up a copy of Shakespeare Through Islamic Worlds. Ambereen, before we end, I'm wondering if you could tell listeners how they can follow you on Twitter and engage with more of your work and keep in touch with latest developments.
So I am at Dr. Dadhabhoy on Twitter, also known as X. I think that's pretty much my primary social media platform. I am on Blue Sky, but I never post anything there. So find me on Twitter or send me an email.
I'm glad you've stayed on what I also continue and insist on calling Twitter. I also opened up a Blue Sky account, but there wasn't the same activity there. And I think we do have to stay even in spaces that seem to become increasingly hostile, just to do the work that we're doing and spread the word, the good word. And you've been doing a lot of that. And so I encourage everyone to follow Dr. Ambereen Dadhabhoy on Twitter as well. And it just leaves me to thank you again for coming on and discussing your wonderful work, and to the listeners for joining us today in what I hope you find is an interesting and engaging conversation about an important book that I hope you will engage with further. Despite listening to this episode, there's a lot more in it that we couldn't cover. And so do pick it up and do